Welcome back, everyone, to Legal Candy. I am your host, attorney Candice Colucci from the Colucci Law Group, and I'm here with my co-host, Miss MK. How are you?
I'm just fine, thank you, Candice. Hello, everyone.
Good. Well, welcome back to our show. Today, we are going to be exploring Scott Peterson and the horrible and tragic death of Laci Peterson and their unborn child, Connor Peterson. This case is from 2002, if you remember how huge this case was. Absolutely a media frenzy when it comes to a trial and circumstances, because it first started on Christmas Eve in 2002 when Laci Peterson, who's 8 months pregnant, goes missing. And the whole world starts looking for this beautiful pregnant woman. And so we are going to go over those facts because it's back in the news now, because finally, after 20 years, Scott Peterson finally actually comes forward and does his own interview, but it's really based on the fact that Netflix has just released a special, a little mini docuseries about Laci Peterson. So in response, it looks like Peacock Network ended up doing their own kind of Scott Peterson's own words. So he has finally come forward and has spoken. And so it brought this whole entire thing back up to light. So we are going to be looking at it from a legal perspective. That's what we do. Our whole goal here is to give you those sweet little nuggets, little information, peel back those layers of what really was taking place legally, along with the facts of the case, so you can better understand what took place all of those years ago and how it's potentially affecting him now. What is he saying now that he...
Sorry about that.
You didn't start the last.
Yeah, I don't remember what the sentence I said.
Oops.
Sorry. So we are going to be looking at what does the case look like now, because even up until this day, he is now with the Innocence Project. So that is an organization that we'll talk about. What does that mean that now they're actually representing Scott Peterson? And so they have filed new motions in court seeking additional evidence, and people are finally kind of relooking at this case. And there are some people who are asking, is Scott Peterson innocent?
After all this time.
After all this time? So stick with us while we talk about that. We'll look at it from our perspective as legal analysts, looking it over so you can better understand what really kind of took place. But before we jump right into it, we'll give a little update on what's happening in the Trump universe, since that is continuously unraveling kind of right in our faces. So the most recent update is that we talked a little bit about Donald Trump and the fact that he had been charged in some of his indictments of his election interference, that whole entire situation. Then we had the Supreme Court. Then we have the Supreme Court that's come back and made those monumental rulings that are now looking at the actual conduct of the president. And what the Supreme Court has said is that it is our decision that the president is immune, has complete immunity from criminal liability, which means he cannot be found criminally responsible for any of the acts that are within his constitutional authority. So that's one. And then we know that there's a different level, that any of the acts that he does that are based on his official authority, then there's a presumption of innocence for any criminal liability. And then anything he does that's not an official act, all bets are off. Go to jail, don't collect $200. Those are the three tiers that the Supreme Court has to determine, which was huge to have that kind of definition. Although they left it very vague of what a constitutional authority is going to be and what's going to define as an official act. So what's interesting is now what's happened is the indictment that was already there now has been refiled. It's been amended, which can happen. Your charges can be amended after you've been charged with a crime. They can still add things to it. They can change some of the facts based on what their investigation's showing. So really what it looks like from the research kind of that you were pulling, what we were seeing is that they were really just kind of redefining the way that they worded this indictment so that hopefully it will be able to skirt around some of those parameters that the Supreme Court has told us. That now they're trying, obviously the government who's filed these charges are hoping that they're going to be able to get them get them stuck, considering of the fact that they've come forward with criminal liability accusations. So they've just kind of reformatted the way that they've kind of filed the indictment.
So they're already starting to apply the immunity ruling.
Yeah.
It's out there already. Like,
well, they're trying to format. They're already getting ready for it. They know it's going to be an issue and a question, so they're going to try to formulate the way they present the case in a way that says, hey, these acts we believe are not really official, or they weren't constitutional authority. So that's kind of how they're reframing that indictment, which is interesting. And then it looks like they took a co-conspirator off. They took Jeffrey Clark off, who's a former Justice Department official who played a role allegedly in Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. I love how it's like it's his effort to overturn. I'm like calling into question of it. I mean, okay, effort to overturn. Like there's some coup that's taking place here. But
seriously,
speaking of headlines, the way things are headlined are so imperative. And I think once we get into the Laci Peterson case, it's really interesting when you start looking at how are these headlines. The way a story is presented to somebody, the way it's headlined is really indicative of the information that they're going to gather from it. And I think we are in a world where headlines have been everything. They're clickbait. It's what leads to companies making billions of dollars off of people clicking it because of the way that it's been titled.
They're not necessarily truthful.
Yeah, they don't have to be. They don't have to be truthful. They can be incorrect. But it is very interesting how that will end up playing a huge role in the Peterson case, because the not social media at the time, but the media outrage and how the public saw him was hugely defining on, I believe, what ends up happening to him ultimately. So that's what we're looking at, Trump. So we will keep you updated on what that election is unraveling to be, and looking forward to that, to the debate, and kind of seeing how that rolls out. I did see the interview with Kamala. And I think it's how you have to. I did see this. I saw this really interesting video where I guess her nieces or something came forward, said this is how you pronounce her name. So I was like, now in my head, I'm like, out of respect, it obviously means something to her. I don't care how you pronounce my name. I've always been a person that's like, literally.
Donald Trump pronounces it 20 different ways.
Yeah, right. I'm like, listen, people have said my name the wrong way so many times. It never bothers me.
Yeah.
But some people take it really personal. They're just like, that's not my name. And I'm like, for me, I'm like, I don't expect you to just meet me and know how to pronounce my name. And I wouldn't find it rude. And I don't think you need to memorize how to pronounce my name. If it's not, my name is Candice. That says Candice. That's what that says. So although my mother decided it says Candice, I can understand why people spell my name.
People don't call you Candice all the time. Do they?
I have had a couple people who've called me Candice. My last name was Rojas, which if you're Hispanic, you would know J is H. Rojas was literally what I was called always, and I just never felt the need to correct people, but a lot of people do. So. Yeah, I did see your interview. I thought it was interesting that everybody was all in arms at the fact that her vice president or her candidate for vice presidency was sitting with her the entire time. I'm just like,
they're like, she doesn't have anything to say.
But I'm like, what? I mean, but he's also the candidate. We don't know anything about him, so I don't think it's awkward for him to be there. But I just thought it was kind of crazy how it turned into this like feminist thing where it was like, how dare she had a man with her. I'm like, all right, okay.
Yeah, I agree.
Let's keep it to the facts. So we will all stay tuned of what's taking place with Trump and Kamala Harris. And then we will get over into this Scott and Laci Peterson. So let's talk about what has taken place back in the day. So this was a case I remember very clearly, as I've told people before, is that I had an interest in murders and mysteries way before I ever became a lawyer. So this was a case that I definitely was very, I remember it being on the news. I remember listening in on it. So before we get into it, let's talk about our legal disclaimer, just so everybody knows. This wherever medium you're listening to this information on, it is not intended to create an attorney-client relationship. The information here is based on publicly researched information or potentially interviews. So if there's anything that may be a discrepancy, go ahead and look it up. We're not the end-all be-all when it comes to factual information. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, or looking for any legal advice, you're more than welcome to reach out to our office, Colucci Law Group, at 727-733-9438. If we can't help you, we'll point you in the right direction of somebody that can. So let's get right into it. So I just remember it so vividly, and I was young when the story was first breaking, but I think what grasped people's attention so much about this case was, I mean, everybody constantly was saying like Laci Peterson was just so beautiful, and she was 8 months pregnant. So it's just like, I think when people think about being 8 months pregnant, which one of my attorney friends who we've been talking about this case, and she's 8 months pregnant, and she's given me such a good insight. She was just like, listen, I'm not going on any long walks. I'm not doing all of that. She was like, but the more interesting thing is like, you're also less likely to be on the run away. Like at 8 months pregnant, you're a lot of people. I mean, there are some people who, are
I was
training
5 months pregnant when this happened.
Yeah. Oh, you were?
With my daughter.
See,
yeah.
I
was
think about
5 months pregnant.
Yeah.
I was not doing long walks.
Yeah.
With the golden retriever.
Yeah.
Or
So, but some people
investigating
walk all the time.
burglaries either.
Exactly.
On the other side.
But also sometimes people do those things if they did them before they were pregnant. But I think that those were kind of the compelling issues, is that she was missing, and it's not normal for a pregnant woman at 8 months to go missing to where she hasn't even contacted her parents. And they're not really a ripe candidate, in my opinion, for kidnapping. I'm like, if you're going to kidnap somebody, I don't really think you're going to be going after. And she was heavily pregnant. Meaning it was obvious she was pregnant. It wasn't questionable, and still absolutely beautiful, but definitely obviously pregnant to anyone who saw her. And so I don't think you're going to be kidnapping, an 8 month pregnant woman, because that's a lot of liability, I feel like, on your hand. Like, you got a lot of stuff happening there. Like, she may go into birth at any time. Are you prepared for that in this van that you've taken her in? So I don't necessarily, I think that those were some of the elements that just made the whole world kind of tune in. And everybody was just like on their seats, like waiting to hear what was going to take place. And so on Christmas Eve, 2002, the world was introduced to Laci Peterson. She was 27 years old. Like, now that I look back at it, I'm like, 27, like such a baby. It's such a baby. So 27 years old. She goes missing, 8 months pregnant. They've got their first child on the way, Connor. She's married to Scott Peterson. By all accounts, an all-American boy, handsome on his own right. And they were just kind of the cute, this is always my favorite thing people always talk about, is like, they're the cute, perfect couple.
Yeah.
You never would have known that there was anything wrong, and and all of those kind of stuff. We were just talking about it before, that those type of men usually scare me the most when people are like, oh my God, he's so sweet, he's so perfect, he's so this, he's so that. I'm like, listen, watch enough Lifetime in your time, and you'll realize a lot of those stories don't usually begin with the fact he was abusive and all of this. There's a lot of these stories which make them usually so compelling, is that they usually start with the fact that it was in a quiet neighborhood. They were a beautiful relationship. No one knew they had any problems. And so this was definitely one of those issues, those kind of cases. So what begins as this desperate search for this missing mother, it quickly unravels into a chilling narrative of betrayal and deceit, and then eventually murder is what it looks like. So as the evidence starts to kind of come in. So she goes missing, and here's what we've got as like a timeline. If we were going to look at it from a timeline perspective, is we know that they originally get married in 1997. They're married for 5 years. People are like, oh, the relationship was great. And I'm like, it's 5 years. Yeah, it better be. It should be after 5 years.
Right.
But yes, okay. So 5 years. And And so her due date is February 10th, 2003. Not too far from my birthday. That's when she's due to give birth to Connor. Now, on Christmas Eve, what takes place in that morning is that from what we've gotten in the case so far is that Scott Peterson decides that he wants to go and take his boat out. So he's just newly gotten a little fishing boat, and he states that around 9:30ish that he leaves the house, and his plan is to go from his house to his storage unit, get the boat. Does he have to leave the boat? He goes and gets the boat. Goes and gets the boat, and then is going to put it all together. And then we find out is he ends up driving 90 miles from where their house is. They're in Modesto, California is where they're at. Once it all kinds of gets put together, what we can see is that there are other areas. Like he kind of testifies, he says in his interviews is that he really just wanted to like test this new boat out, get it in the water. But he doesn't go to any of the local kind of spots. He ends up going an hour and a half. But I thought interesting because he goes an hour and a half north and he travels kind of up the coastline. So it means there's all of these potential spots that he could have stopped to put his boat in. And he goes up there.
Cold. And he wanted to go golfing originally. He told everybody he was going golfing. And then suddenly he goes fishing and it's too cold to go golfing. But wouldn't it be a little chilly out there on the water too?
Yeah.
You know?
You would think that if it's too cold to go golf, that the last thing you want to do is be on the water. So those were all some of those questions that a lot of people have. And so he goes and he is supposedly says that he goes prior, grabs all of his stuff, he goes out there, he fishes, and he's out on this boat until around 4:30 p.m. When he leaves the house, he says that that Laci was preparing to go walk their family dog, Mackenzie, and allegedly mop the floors. So Mackenzie, our beautiful golden retriever, becomes one of the star witnesses, I think, in this case. We hear a lot about this Mackenzie and the dog in this kind of situation, but we won't end up hearing a lot about it in trial, which is a huge issue based on, as we talked about before, the difference between the facts that we know and what ends up coming into trial are sometimes two different things that can lead to the change in what happens as far as a verdict is concerned. And I do believe that's a huge pivotal issue. Is some of the facts that did not come into trial could have potentially changed the result of the verdict. So he is on his way back. He returns like at 4:30. When he's on his way back, he makes a phone call. He leaves a voice message on his wife's phone because she doesn't answer. And he says something like, da 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 da, like, what are you doing?
Beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful. Super sweet, beautiful. Yeah. And can you get this or pick something up or da 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 da? And he's like, all right, I guess I'll talk to you later. And then he gets home. He reportedly eats pizza, showers, washes his clothes. Here's where I think is pretty interesting, is that he washes his clothes, and he does do all this before he calls Laci's mother, Sharon, and he doesn't call her until around 5:15 to ask if Laci's with her. Now, I don't find the prosecution's of making a really big deal, and so does the media, that he waited all of that time to call to see where she was at. I'm not really concerned about the time he waited because you don't think there's anything wrong. So you come home, she's not there. I mean,
she could be with her mother or sister.
He hasn't even called her again yet.
You know,
So she could have been somewhere. But what I thought was interesting was one of the things that they found during where the laundry was at was that somebody had taken out the wet towels that were in the washer and they're like rags and stuff, like cleaning rags. Like she obviously must have been cleaning, and they put it on top of the dryer. And then that's where he did this. And then that's where he had put in the clothes that he was wearing. What he tells the detectives is that the reason why he did this was because his clothes were wet, because while he was fishing, it rained. And so his clothes were super wet. So he takes them off and he decides, I got to wash them right now. So I put them in the washer. So what what I do think is interesting about that is like I don't see the necessary need to do all of that, and it does always tell me that somebody's in a hurry because this I know I've got
when I do that,
kid who does this. I know nothing. Yeah, nothing can make my mom more angry, okay, and me than showing up in your laundry room and there being wet, sopping clothes on top of the dryer because someone didn't open up the dryer, take the dryer out, and put them in there. They were in a hurry and they throw it all into they're like, oh, I got to get my stuff washed right now. And so he doesn't do that. The investigator also says that he said, I saw that there was a jacket in the back of the truck and the jacket wasn't wet. So that was another question of really did his clothes actually get wet? So that was a kind of trigger for me was this, you're just hurried to wash your clothes. But
he's also a man though.
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
Christmas Eve.
He could, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Maybe you don't want to take your wet clothes that may be dirty. You didn't want them to be sitting on the dryer. That's the reason why I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
You didn't want them, maybe you wanted to wear the pants again. Who knows? But so by 5:15, she's missing. So the calls start going out and all of the other people started getting notified of the fact that there was this missing pregnant woman. And so everybody starts getting together and the team just rallies around. So you've got everybody looking for her. You've got call centers. You've got 911 tip lines. You have got him out there. Yeah. But this is where it all kind of starts becoming question and suspect is whenever the very few opportunities we got to hear from Scott Peterson was that he lacked what seemed to be any emotions towards it. And I'll tell you, because I've watched these interviews of him being interviewed now, and his explanation for it is really based on the fact of him saying that like I wasn't gonna, he felt villainized by the media, which rightfully so. That's absolutely whenever a woman goes missing, we'll talk about that statistic. So what's interesting statistics is that people don't know is that according to studies, the number one leading cause of death for pregnant women and women who have just given birth is murder by an intimate partner. Like you are the most victimization. You are the most vulnerable and highly likely to be murdered at the time of your pregnancy and right afterwards, which was really interesting. That the number is higher than issues with pregnancy. Issues that happen during birth, like people dying during the birth. To think that it's from the partner. Yeah. So that's really kind of what starts everything. The original thing is when a woman goes missing 8 months pregnant, the very first thing they're looking at is going to be the partner, right? We know that. And so that was where their eyes were set from the very beginning. When then you couple it with a lack of emotion, then you've got a lot of people who are all questioning going, okay, something doesn't look right. Because the one thing we've always tried to explain to everybody is that the jury, which when we say that they are your peers, like they're supposed to be this unbiased group of your peers, the people that could have possibly been in your life, normal people. Those type of people, whether it be 12 or 10,000, people in general are very, very judgmental to a higher degree. Like a higher degree. That's what we've learned about juries. And that's what we've learned about people. While you're sitting on social media, you've seen it, right? They are so judgmental. So that's why I always tell my clients, a lie is a lie is a lie. You lie one time to a jury, they'll never believe you ever again. Right. So you got to be so careful of what you ever say and making sure that there are no lies. The jury is unforgiving of it. But they also have preconceived notions. Not only do jury members, but also do police officers and members of the public, that they really do have a preconceived notion of the way people should behave in situations like this. They think that the way that it should look is that this husband should be hysterically crying And he should be pleading for her safe return. He should be doing this. He should be doing that. And the minute that the preconceived notion varies from the actual actions, the police are so keen on it. They get right on it and they're like, listen, this doesn't make sense, right? And then so does a jury. A jury gets the same way. A jury is just like, whoa, this shouldn't be the way that this person should act. It doesn't make it right, because I'll tell you, there are times when we learn that people's behavior are not the stereotypical behavior or stereotypical response. And so there are times when you get it wrong, when you're wrong, when you're like, okay, well, they weren't overly emotional or any of that kind of stuff. I just heard somebody talking about John Benet Ramsey, another case we have to do at some point, but that, that was determined that they cleared the parents, but I don't know if you remember, because that's another case I remember very well. Oh. Those parents, what were they doing? I mean, everybody was like, there was a time they caught them laughing. So they said a joke and they were laughing. Yeah. And I think it's because everybody deals with grief differently, right? But then also, in a case like this, I think when it comes to Scott, you also, as we were talking about, I have a personal story where I have been involved with somebody that was missing. And I can tell you that the way that I handled it and the family, there are people in the family who handled it to where we were like, game on. Like we were like, got to be focused. We got to figure out where the evidence is, the information. You're not thinking that she's not coming back. You're not thinking that they're not going to find her. You're not thinking that she's going to be found dead. There are people who get like positive mindset and go, okay, no, everything's going to be fine. I can still kind of, I can make it through this. So his reactions were not typical to the image that the mass public has on how somebody should behave if their wife is missing. That's really what it was. Does that mean that it's obvious that he committed the crime? Absolutely not. Because like I said before, we've had situations where there has been husbands who have no emotional reaction and come to find out they didn't murder them. But that's just how they are as a person. Like they don't know the last time they've cried. They don't know last time they were overly emotional about something. Like, listen, I know people have dated men who have literally been emotionless. And I know they've dated women who's been emotionless. But there are sometimes men that through whatever happens in their life, this is kind of who they are personality-wise. But that became monumental for him and very, very obvious from the beginning that the media was not going to be forgiving to him from day one. From day one. He from the way he acted, even when he was in the interview, like they were so against him from the jump. So everyone's looking for this beautiful, beautiful woman, and they can't find her. So what's interesting is that obviously a lot of their investigation, and I think it was definitely interesting when you watch these documentaries and interviews years ago, and then when they come back around and the story resurfaces and somebody else wants to do a new documentary and they go back to like the officers. That was an interesting case of this one is I just recently was able to watch some newer interviews with the same detectives who gave kind of new information. And what I can say is that the investigators should be unbiased. They should absolutely be unbiased the entire time. I mean, until you get a jury verdict at this point in time, they really should be saying completely unbiased. And you could absolutely tell just by the interviews with them that they made it really clear. They were like, listen, he's a nice guy. He comes across as likable, very respectful, they said. That was what the detectives were saying. He was very respectable. But he lacked the emotions that we felt that we needed in order to really rule him out.
Calm and collected.
And that's crazy that they really put a lot of stock into the way somebody reacts to situations to that way. But I definitely think that really soon off, like just soon afterwards, they were under the impression that they believed that this man had committed this crime, and that's why they were gunning to try to get an arrest warrant. So where it kind of takes a hold is that everybody's looking for her, and then we get Miss Amber Fry. Amber Fry. I remember when she comes on, everybody's like, oh, now it all makes sense. Now it all makes sense.
Yeah.
She comes forward by calling a tip line. She calls a tip line and just says, listen, I'm Scott Peterson's girlfriend, and I've been with him for months, and I think I may have some information that you may want to hear. And so the detectives jump right on that. They go straight over and they interview her, and all of those goodies. And so this is where the first lies happen, because just like I said, you can't lie to the jury. You cannot lie to detectives. And as soon as you lie to a detective, same thing.
That's it.
They don't believe anything you said. So one of the first questions they always ask, which they ask, Scott Peterson, was, tell us about your marriage. How was it? Everything going fine? How's life? That's always a question, because they want to know, is there any possibility that maybe Laci ran away?
Right.
Maybe it was an abusive relationship and she didn't want to be in it anymore and she doesn't want him to find her. Those are things that an officer is trying to rule out. Is that what maybe happened here? So they asked him those questions too. And guess what he didn't bring up? Didn't bring up his little girl on the side. He did not bring her up. So that is a huge piece of information that is really common in a lot of these cases when they are investigating the significant other, is when they find out they have another significant other, then that gives them more likelihood of motive. That's really what they're looking for in cases. Every single officer and detective and attorney, motive is a huge, huge question. And it's not 100% always the end all be all, but it is a huge factor. We, as the defense, are arguing that this person didn't have the motive. And then the detectives and the state attorneys, prosecutors are arguing, here's all the motive you need. Because if there is no motive, a jury does question that. They want to know, well, tell me why. Because the jury doesn't really, as a whole, believe people randomly commit crimes. That's not really a huge likelihood. The general sense, which is how you have to think about when you're a trial litigator, is what is the general public looking at? And the general public thinks there's usually a connection when a crime happens. Like they knew someone, unless it's like a purse robbery. Yeah, okay, maybe that's going to be something. But when you're talking about murder, something, as most people say, is pretty intimate, taking someone's life, there's usually a correlation and a connection to it. That somewhere along the line, there's some type of motive there. And that's what a jury really looks for. So if you don't have one, that becomes a huge question. So I know for a fact when the officers and detectives are working it, they're going, where is the motive? You're married for 5 years. You have a child on the way. From point in time, they do maybe find out he didn't really want kids. So that could have maybe been slightly their motive. But as soon as they find out about Miss Amber, they are like, there's your motive there. So she comes forward. They go over there. They interview her, and she is a willing participant. She's like, whatever you need my help doing, let me know.
And she stated that Scott had told her he was unmarried and he had lost his wife.
Yeah. So So what's interesting with her is that the one thing I always try to tell people that they don't understand during an investigation, actually almost at any time, but definitely during an investigation, the police are allowed to lie to you. They are allowed to lie to you. And people go, oh my God, what are you talking about? I'm like, oh, yeah, they can. And it happens a lot. So what's interesting when you watch back some of these investigations, you're kind of like, that's why we have these words like entrapment. There are some certain times where those lies can go too far, and then one of your defenses to a crime could be entrapped, that you were entrapped by the police. You can also have defenses sometimes that your confession was not voluntary because of the lies. Like, so there is a level, but let me just make it clear.
Is that a fine line?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's no fine line to what the lie can be, how big the lie can be. So they can't lie about religious things. We've talked about that before. So they really start this underground investigation with Amanda, and Amber. So they really start this kind of behind the scenes investigation with Amber, the mistress, who makes it very clear, don't call her a mistress. We did see that. She was like, I think she was more offended that she was termed a mistress than anything else. I think that was a huge issue for her, because she said, I am not a mistress because I did not know about the wife, and a mistress is someone who knows about the wife. And I didn't look that up because I was like, I don't really know if that's what I mean. I was like, but that is a huge issue for her, is that she was very, very against the way she was looking to the media. The very first, she ends up doing her own press conference and then getting her own lawyer. It's Gloria Allred, of course. Because she's a victim of Scott's lies, and I guess needed an attorney. And so she does more than one, I think, press conference. She does one press conference by herself and goes up there, and it really was to set the record straight about the fact that she did not know that he was married. Right. That's what she made very clear, which was very interesting for her to do a press conference. But honestly, if you're looking at as devil's advocate, which is what we're really going to do today, we're going to do a little bit more devil's advocate. I think we try to do it, but we're definitely going to lay it on, because this was a question of how guilty do you really feel that Scott Peterson is? Looking at it now, as an attorney, as a trial litigator, I'm looking at it going, God, there really isn't as much evidence as I would have thought when I was younger, because this case was not broadcast. The entire trial, they did not have cameras in it the entire time, like where they were broadcasting it on TV. There was just notes from reporters every single day. There's a couple snippets here and there, but other than that, is that it was very much based on what the media was letting us know was taking place, unless you've read all the transcripts. So now looking at it as, Monday morning quarterbacking, there was a lot of areas in it that made me question and look at like the strength of this case that I used to think existed, because it was a really good question that the defense had asked and had said kind of during closing, was the defense says, we get it. And this is kind of something that like a defense attorney would do. And we always say is our goal as defense attorneys is to try to take the wind out of the other side's sails. So which means if we know something's bad or hurtful, we need to say it and come out right away and say it, make it very clear. So in closing, the defense attorney, his attorneys really makes it clear, like, yes, he cheated on his wife. That's not good. He may have lacked the emotions that you think that he should have had, and he may have told some lies. That's a lot of stuff. But that alone doesn't make him a murderer, right? So that was huge to try to make it clear to a jury that those things don't necessarily point the finger that somebody is a murderer. But let me tell you, it is hard to convince a jury of that, because I know some women that if you cheat on them, they would have no problem to continue to in prison. They're like, well, sounds about right. Sounds about right. Even if they weren't sure if you'd committed that crime. So there are serious, I believe, biases that are created just from people who have been cheated on before, or have been in a relationship like that. And so there's definitely a lot of things that were kind of going on behind the scenes. But one of the things was the investigation starts this whole entire taped phone calls between Amber and Scott. So they do get a warrant to wiretap his phone. The wiretap laws have changed a lot, but at that time in California, what you have to do is put enough evidence together that you believe this person has committed a crime, and you believe that you'll get further evidence from their phone calls. And so based on that, you can get it granted, and then you can tap their phone calls without them knowing.
Didn't she agree to work with the prosecution?
Yeah, so she absolutely agreed to work with them. She says, I will stage these phone calls, and so you guys can keep recording them. So I think they ended up having like 29 hours worth of phone calls recorded. And every single time they actually, the detectives say that they were impressed at how well Amber did, like that she did a really good job, like staging these conversations. And I thought this was interesting was one of the detectives who was part of the investigation doing these phone calls with Amber, these controlled calls between Amber and Scott, stated that they really kind of felt that Amber was still holding on to hope. That there was a part of her that was hoping that Laci would be found alive and that, that based on that, he would be cleared as a suspect and that she could be with him. Like, that's what this detective said. And I didn't agree with that. I was like, and so this just gives you an example of how these perceptions sometimes detectives have are imperative with how they proceed on a case sometimes, how they investigate it, how they determine their opinions, their biases that are potentially created. But I'm like, okay, if you really think he's innocent, is the first phone call you're going to be making to the tip line be like, hey, listen, I'm going to need to give you some information. I'm like,
but I hope we get back together.
Yeah. I feel like if I would have thought that my boyfriend was maybe innocent of this crime, I would have been like, okay, let's talk about it. All right. So let's make this whole entire living room into like a scene. Tell me where you're at. Like, I would be running my own investigation. Like let me know. Not, hey, I'll do tape phone calls with him and you and all this stuff. I'm like, I don't know if he wanted to make her look better. But I was just kind of like, no, I don't really think that. So one of the phone calls that does become extremely damaging, I think this was probably one of those pivotal things in the trial, was that one of the taped phone calls, he says to her that he initially says he's not married. Then, and listen, Scott's a liar, okay? He's a liar. Yeah. So there's no way around the fact that he's a liar. And he's one of those liars that will lie until he is presented with like the evidence that and then his story will change based on the information that you know. We all know a lot of people that way. So that's not surprising. Unfortunately, it doesn't make them a murderer, but he definitely is a very crafty liar when it comes to the information that he's given. So he starts by saying, I'm not married. Then he finds out that through a mutual friend that she knows that he's married. So that's the very first information that he ends up finding out. So once he finds out that Amber knows he's married, even though he's still searching for his girl, his wife, and his missing child, he assumes that Amber has not heard this on the news, which is pretty interesting. But so the mutual friend says, "Hey, listen, Amber knows you're married. So and so bumped into her and said that you're married." And he's like, "Okay, now what am I going to tell her?" So then the phone calls are him calling her, going, "Listen, I know I lied to you. I am married, but I lost my wife." That's what he says. I lost my wife. She doesn't ask any other questions, clarify any of those kind of stuff, which also makes me think it was supposed to be a controlled call. And the detective said, Amber's like a professional. But she doesn't ask the next question of like, what do you mean what do you mean
Can
she's
you elaborate?
Lost? You know what I mean?
Yeah. How did she die?
But regardless, I mean, I think it's weird that she doesn't ask about how was she lost, but I guess she doesn't want to ask questions about supposedly this ex or whatever, and he acted emotional about it, I think is what she said. So he says that we lost her, and now this is when he has this phone call with Amber. It is not one of the control calls. This is before. This is Amber saying this is what happened. Is that he says, okay, I've lost, I think he just says I've lost her, right? Yeah. So he just goes, so he tells her that he's lost his wife. She says, I didn't ask him what he meant by that because I just assumed she had died. And I didn't want to open up, old wounds or any of that kind of stuff. So they continue to keep on talking. I think this is 9 days before she actually goes missing, is when they have this conversation. So when we're talking about timeline, there is a correlation when we're talking about motive of, and these are the things that are like on my side of why I'm like, okay, if we're going to talk about if he's guilty, these will be the pieces of evidence, is that the timeline really correlates to where he starts getting into hot water with Amber, right? So he's going to have to come forward and say something to her at some point in time, since he already found out that somebody knew that he was married, and now he's lied to her and said that he's lost her. So I'm like, at that point in time, I think he really is at a rock and a hard place, because what are your options now? Either you stop talking to this girl Amber, or you're gonna have to clarify what you meant by lost at some point in time, which she's gonna ask. But so that's where I think the timeline starts adding up to where, why would he had a motive to maybe have gotten rid of his wife and child, is because at that same time, his mistress is finding out about her. And now he's made this story up that she's lost, and now he's going, what am I going to do?
Right.
Like, what am I going to do? If he had been in this affair for years and they never talked about getting together, any of that kind of stuff, and then all of a sudden his wife goes missing, it's not so much of a correlation. You're like, what is it that sparks it now? And I think what sparks it at that point in time, potentially, is that it starts getting kind of suspect from Amber's perspective of what's really going on in his life. So that becomes a huge issue, is this whole conversation he has where he says his wife was lost, or she's gone before she actually is gone. So then when the cops get involved and they're doing these recorded calls, they're just like having regular conversations. And now I don't know who brings it up, but at some point in time it's brought up to now her, and now he finally has to tell her again, listen, I lied again. Okay. I don't know if you've seen the news or not, but I'm actually married. My wife is 8 months pregnant, and she now is missing. And that's where on the recorded call, Amber says, well, what do you mean? She got this like little voice. That's not even like her actual voice, by the way. Like her actual voice is one thing, but the voice on all these recordings was like this little meek girl.
Gypsy Rose.
Yeah, she was like, well, I don't know what you mean. What do you mean by lost? And I was like, and listen, when the detectives were like, this was the best, I would have been like, I don't know who that girl is, because let me tell you how my phone calls would have been if you had live been like, listen here. They would have been like, bleep, 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 bleep. They wouldn't even be able to play it in a courtroom. Yeah, they wouldn't be able to play it in a courtroom. They'd be like, listen, we weren't able to play this because there's a lot of things that were said on here cannot be repeated in the court of law. Because her demeanor was like, I mean, like, bless her heart. She was just like, well, I just don't understand what you mean by, you told me weeks ago that she was lost, and now you're telling me that she's actually lost. That's what she says. Bless her freaking heart. I'm like, oh, what is happening? So that becomes, in my opinion, huge. I mean, when you take this full trial, guys, and we're going to go through it, and you're going to see there are questionable things with this full trial. That, to me, if I had to put on our list of the number one things that the jury is going to use, the jury will either determine your guilt by the cold, hard evidence that exists, in addition to if they like you or not. Those are going to be your things. That's what it comes down to. And there is really no way around it. It's how they're going to determine every witness of who they're going to believe or not, is based on how that person came across. Do they like them, and do they not like them? If they like you, you're more believable. Like, they're going to believe what you say. If they trust you because they like you, then you're believable. If they don't like you, they automatically don't trust you, and they don't believe anything that you've said. So that's really what it comes down to. And I believe that piece was tremendously impactful for a jury to hear that. Now, once we'll talk about is that Scott doesn't take the stand. But his audio recordings of him and Amber that come in become very, very important. I think that becomes huge. So they start recording these phone calls, and they're just getting this Scott guy who's just living his two lives. I think one of the craziest calls, okay? One of the craziest calls is the call that he has where he's telling Amber that he is in Paris on New Year's.
That was insane.
Oh my God.
That was
I was like,
lie just
I couldn't get under the table like fast enough.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God. Where he's at during this call, where he's like, Amber, I can barely hear you. I mean, like, he had to have been playing an audio of like fireworks or something. He's like, I can barely. He must have been watching TV
or something.
He's watching TV. Yeah. He's watching the actual thing. I know. I don't even know, because I think he's supposed to be at the. He's at the visual. He's at the visual for his missing wife and child, and then sneaks away to do this phone call that he like tells her that he's in Paris watching the Eiffel Tower like light up and all of this stuff and all of these things because of the time difference. He's even done the math on like the time difference. So what all those things do is show that Scott is a craftful liar. Liar. And so there's just so many recordings of it that just shows he lacks emotion. He should be devastated this time, but instead he's still carrying on this relationship, saying, you know, that he can't wait to see her and all this other stuff and all of these things. So based on that, the police department does try to get a warrant for the arrest of Scott, and they are unable to do that. Mm-hmm. And one of the main things, what is it that the department is requiring?
They need a body. They were under a lot of pressure. So there was $500,000 offered for anybody who could find her, and they said, you are not getting this until we find a body.
So the question that we've seen is, why do they need a body? Well, the thing is, it is discretionary. Every department, every city, it all depends on who's running it, who's the state attorney at that time, who is the head detective, lead detective, any of those kind of people. All those people play a role in potentially deciding, do they feel like they have enough circumstantial evidence or direct evidence, as we talked about those before. Direct evidence, is that what it signs? Direct evidence. Circumstantial is we can't see it as direct, but because of all the other factors, we can assume that evidence is connected in the way that we have presented it as being connected. Mm. But so one of the key factors a lot of times is there a body? And there are just some departments who will say, like, that's what, so an example like this was whoever was the lead prosecutor or whoever was making the shot caller there, they had determined we need a body or we're not filing charges. There are times without a body, they can file charges. Another department down the street could be doing it. They could have done it 5 years ago. But whatever it is, because of all the totality of the circumstances in this situation, it does make sense that there isn't so much direct evidence at that point in time. There really isn't really anything. It's all really circumstantial evidence at that point, that they're like, if we don't have a body, we don't have enough. We don't have enough to go forward. And I do believe that in that instance, it's absolutely correct. I happen to be of the opinion, without a body, unless you had some overwhelming information that's like, you have video of the dead body, you have video of the people doing it, and even though you don't end up with the actual body because we know it gets disposed of, that to me could lead to where you could have a trial without ever finding the body. But without a body, I have seen people, there are people who are sitting in jail right now who have been found guilty when they're never found a body. And that has always not sat well with me.
Yeah.
Because as we talked about it, I'm a lifetime girl. So which means any crazy plausible story, I'm on it. I'm like, that could have been it. That could have been it. So when you tell me somebody is dead and missing, and you never find a body, there are people who have run away, and to never be found. And there are people who have willingly, hid themselves for so many different reasons. But that being said,
similar to little Kaylee Anthony too, isn't it? Like they needed that body.
Yeah.
But that's purely subjective. That just, wow.
There is no legal requirement that you have to have the actual body in order to charge them with murder, which is an interesting thing.
So that's the prosecutor's discretion.
It would be between all of them. So it would be, because remember we talked about before, is that the police department can makes the initial charges when the prosecution or the government, state attorney, they're the ones who actually make the next decision to file on it, to make it an official charging. So either one of them can decide. So the police department can decide, we don't have a body, but we're still going to arrest him and push the charges through. And then you can have a state attorney who comes back and go, no, we're going to dismiss these charges right now until you bring me a body. Nice. So it's all based on what is the likelihood of success. That is really what the parameters most of the time of what the state attorney's office is looking at and what the detectives are looking at is the likelihood of success on this case. And that's really kind of, if you think about it, you put it all together, they shouldn't be arresting someone that they don't think is likely that they're going to be found guilty, or they don't think it's likely they committed the crime. So it all kind of correlates together. But that's really in this instance. They said, listen, unless we get a body, we're not going to be knocking down Scott's door. So in April of 2003, we're talking 5 months, a little more than 4 months after the Laci Peterson and her son, unborn son, go missing. It is the most unfortunate discovery is that they find her body and the body of her son. It washes up on the shore, and it is devastating for the parents, absolutely, for Scott's family, and I would say whoever believes Scott's innocent, for Scott, and then also for the world. I think that I just remember when they'd find the bodies, and I'd not identified them yet, but they had at least said there's been the body of a woman, and it was just her torso, which was horrible.
It was a dog walker. Somebody was walking their dog.
Could you imagine that? They end up finding, they find Connor first. I think they find him first, and the next day they find him with his umbilical cord still attached to a little baby.
I know.
Oh, my heart. And then they find Laci the very next day. So now we are going to get into what takes place during this trial of Scott Peterson that now is so compelling that he has now been granted the free defense of the Innocence Project, which is an amazing organization that, they have to accept your case, and they have accepted his case. So the world is now looking back at this trial and going, did we get it wrong? Is there a possibility that Scott Peterson is actually innocent? So stick with us to the next episode, and we will get into those nitty-gritty details of the Scott Peterson murder trial. Bye.
Bye-bye.